infographic about the TV show Friends. But as an overview, you can see there's a large Friends title, somewhat mimicking the logo that people might be familiar with. Below, viewers can see the exact apartment building and layout that the Friends spent much of their time in. They can also see where the Friends lived together at one point or another and who they lived with. Moving further right, viewers can then see exactly how many cups of coffee each character drank throughout the 10 seasons, since coffee played such a big part of the show. And on the far right, you can see graphics and fun details from some of the most memorable holiday episodes, starting from the beginning of the year all the way until the end of the year. Across the bottom, I created a graphical display of the 6 Friends characters, accompanied by the New York skyline, and the infamous orange couch and lamp seen in the opening credits and in the coffee shop that they frequented. The first step of my process was identifying visual potential. As a whole, it's a way that different types of information can be displayed, so that the viewer can see this information visually or graphically portrayed. I exploited the visual potential of numbers related to my topic by using an isotype display, which means that I utilized a single icon or graphic, in this case my coffee cup, and used that figure repeatedly, changing the amount for each person. This way it allowed viewers to visually see how many cups of coffee I was referencing. I exploited the visual potential of location for my Friends topic by showing exactly where the Friends lived. I used the apartment exterior as a reference for where in the building and on what floor the layout for 2 of their apartments were. Additionally, everything located within the apartment is in the exact position as on the show, giving viewers a reference to where exactly the characters hung out, slept, and ate. I exploited the visual potential of time by including snippets and fun facts from memorable holiday episodes throughout the show. I did so in a column, following the order of having the top event occur first and the bottom event occur last. I exploited the visual potential of relationship by using colored lines to connect people to apartments that they have lived in at one point or another in the show. If you follow the line, you can see the relationship of where the characters once lived and the building or apartment that they were once in. I exploited the visual potential of appearance, first by focusing on my Friends title, using shapes like circles in between characters, and including a graphic of a coffee cup, as that was such a significant part of the show. But I later worked on my much larger display of the actual Friends characters with the cityscape in the background. This one I focused a lot on colors and depicting the Friends accurately without too many details, and used very structured and square-like shapes to complete the cityscape. The next thing I wanted to focus on when creating my infographic was how I would use encodings throughout it. To me, that meant looking at one specific attribute and seeing how that can be translated visually. For my relationship model, I focused on using colors associated with different characters. So the character would have a colored background box and the same matching color for the lines connecting to the apartments that they once lived in. This made it quickly identifiable for the viewers to see things like who moved the most and where they lived at one point or another. For my numbers display, while I used the same icon, size, and color for each character to show how many cups of coffee they drank, I did change the amount of cups, or if you look at it another way, the length of the line for each character. I did this by altering the size of the last cup to signify exactly how many cups they drank visually. Each cup can be seen to represent 50 cups of coffee drank on the show. I also took advantage of encoding by the position of each character, showing that there was a hierarchy, with Phoebe drinking the most amount, and Rachel drinking the least. I was playing around with the idea of changing the size of my cups, with the larger cups signifying more cups of coffee drank on the show, but this didn't allow the viewer to see the exact differences in amount, so I chose against this ultimately. For my time display, I focused on the position up and down the column. I feel I could have made this perhaps a bit more obvious as from a simple glance at it doesn't scream timeline or seem to have any significance towards time. I could have positioned my events around a circle or made the events protruding from an actual line instead. But since my topic was fairly lighthearted for this section, the order of events truly wasn't that significant, and I chose to have it match my visual model more closely than to have my encoding take center stage. For my location section, the position of things is obviously a very important component, but I also played around with color. I essentially tried to highlight on which floor of the building, in orange, to signify that this was the precise floor that the interiors were corresponding to. This is the color model I used to base most of my decisions off of for my infographic. I assessed this model as being mostly complementary, as the two main colors that stood out to me were that orangey color and that light blue, and since those were across from each other on the color wheel, I assessed that as complementary. Because the background is white and the primary colors that jump out at you are those blues and oranges, the overall feel of the infographic seems pretty fun and lighthearted, and not too intense with dark colors or anything too rich. There are several specific cases where I used color to highlight certain things in my infographic. The first being one that I already discussed, of highlighting the second floor of the apartment exterior to indicate that this was the floor that the friends lived on. In another location on my infograph, I used the orange color on the couch and lamp in the cityscape because this color really popped against that dark blue, and I wanted to highlight that this is a really important feature that I added, as it's in the opening credits of the show, and it's an iconic couch that they sat on almost every day, so I wanted this to pop against that background. One area where I definitely used color to encode was in my relationship section. Here, as I mentioned, I used a different color for each of the 6 friends. I did this to make it easier for the viewer to see which lines were referencing which characters, but I do feel that this departed a bit from my color model, as I had to pull 6 different colors that weren't prominently used in the color model. They're definitely there, but not used as much as my lines would make it seem. I felt it was really important to include the orange and blue colors in every section of my display, because that is exactly what my color model does. So I made a point to do so, but I also wanted to make things trigger an association and have certain things stand out to the Friends fans that they could remember from the show. So I tried to do a balance of making certain graphics seem realistic and altering just a few colors to incorporate what was in my model. For example, that big graphic on the bottom of all of the friends, I tried to make that look as realistic to the actual picture as possible, and I felt that I definitely had more liberty to do so because one of the main components of my color model was this large hand that included many different tan colors within it and different blues on the sleeve of that hand. So I felt I had enough colors to play around for skin tone to make it look realistic, and that it followed my color model because those colors were used on a hand, which is another part of the body. So I felt I matched my color model pretty well doing this, and just altered different shades of blue for their clothing and pulled from the black in that top corner for a lot of their hair. Another area of the model that I wanted to trigger an association was in the Friends title. That is something that was really iconic for the show, having these colored dots in between each of the letters. So I took the liberty to pull red that was used sparingly in the color model, and that blue and orangey color into dots between all of the characters in that title so that it would look close enough to the actual title but also follow my color model. The final key piece of importance for me was making sure that all of my headers of each section had a blue background with the black text over it, because that's one thing that I noticed in every single header section of my color model. It followed this same blue background with the black font over top. For my typography, I tried to mimic what was found in my visual model, and from there I identified two different types of fonts. The first being that font that was used in the title, that is rather large and loopy, and then the more rigid and structured all uppercase font throughout the rest of the model. The uppercase font appeared to be sans serif and rather narrow, and one of the things I struggled with was that in my visual model they used two different colors for the font, which made the appearance of it look a little different, and from my color model I could only use black. So I had to mess around with things like the weight and the stretch of the font, and also worry about readability, as it appeared to be a bit harder to read in my model against a white background with black font than in the visual model with a yellow background and a lighter, more purple font. For the Friends title in the upper left, I struggled to find a font that fit exactly that one, because the Batmobile title starts with an uppercase B disconnected from the rest of the word, and then the rest of the word is lowercase, somewhat cursive, and certain parts of it aren't connected to every letter. So I found a cursive font for mine that seemed to fit pretty good, but I chose to depart from my model a bit by having the entire title be all uppercase, and I made sure that none of the letters were connecting. I departed because I wanted people and fans of Friends to be able to easily recognize that I was mimicking the actual Friends logo. So I took the liberty of making this slight difference, but also trying to have this big, more whimsical font for the title that departs from the rest of the font. In my model, I wasn't able to see any identity labels that specified exactly what a graphic element was representing, nor did I see precision labels for anything within that model as well. I did see the use of precise values in the left upper section when talking about certain aspects of the car, so I made sure to try and mimic and get metrics in that same section for my display as well. I did notice that there was a great amount of use of annotations when focusing on the interior section of the car in the model. They labeled exactly what they were pointing to, but in this section it didn't really fit with my relationship model, so I focused more on the leader lines and how they stylized those. So I tried to make my relationship model have similar bends with circle end caps on it to try and replicate what was seen in the same section of the model. One area where I tried to match the labels as best I could was in the left section of my model. In the visual model, they have three different views of a car, from the top view, side view, and rear view. So I tried to do the same type of thing with my apartment building, having an exterior view, and then the two models, or the two apartments that I focus on, are kind of looking in at a bird's eye view. And I wanted my labels to be simple, just like the model, with a colored box behind and the text above with a simple line either from the top or bottom. The visual language of my model varied drastically as you looked throughout it. The most eye-catching piece was obviously that big car in the bottom of the page, which had a lot of different elements to it. It was complex in that it had a lot of interior detail, mostly through the use of line treatments, some being curved, some a little bit more rigid, and with the two different colors of black and purple, it kind of gave the effect of shadowing. So this had a lot of detail to it, but wasn't extremely photographic realistic. Whereas if you look to the right of the car, you see a very, very simple city that has a lot of rectangles and squares to make up the primary pieces of that city. So this was something I definitely tried to do when creating my version of the skyline. I tried to use a lot of those same shapes and simplicity in contrast to the car that they made. When I made my graphic of the 6 friends, I tried to make it realistic as the car was realistic, but I opposed from my model by not including any interior lines, so I just did solid shapes of varying colors to make up my entire display. So I used a lot of the different colors that were also found in my visual model, not the exact colors, but the variation of them, to try and mimic the model for my display without the exact complexity that they did. If you look elsewhere in my model, they use a lot of graphics, but most of them do not have outlines around the external shape, but within it they use a lot of lines to highlight certain features of the car, and you can see a lot of different colors in some, and then some are much more simple, like the fire extinguisher or bat phone, which do not have a lot going on with them in comparison to some of the cars that were made. Noting these features, I tried to mimic this by not including outlines in a lot of my graphics, but making sure I had a high level of detail or lines that I could make within some of those graphics. So you can see that I focused a lot on that in my relationship model by including a high level of lines and internal little details as my visual model did. There's quite a bit of visual hierarchy in my infographic, as there's quite a few places where the variation is rather significant or the prominence of certain elements really stands out. The first of which would definitely be that really large graphic on the bottom of the friends. This takes up a lot of room on my infographic, and it's really different from everything else as there's no words, it's all visual, and it's the first thing that a viewer sees, and a lot of them will recognize some of the characters and know that instantly this is about the TV show Friends. The title, Friends, explicitly states this, and I think that also stands out because it's in the upper corner, different font from everything else on there, and it has a lot more space than any of the other sections. From there, I think the viewer definitely browses from left to right as the rest of the infographic is set up into 4 main columns. This is definitely done so through the use of those leader lines, so you can see clear vertical sections of my infographic. And then within those sections, I think that the reader kind of gets a top to bottom run through of each, as there's a lot of vertical elements within those columns as well, whether that be from the stacked names in the relationship display or the lines of copy that go in order of greatest to least, and then even with the holidays again in order, you can see that the viewer's eyes will read from top to bottom. Because of the amount of graphics I have in my model, it also lends itself for those to be more prominent than the text associated with it. In most of the areas on my infographic, I have a graphic and then certain text either above or to the side of it. So I think that readers will first see the graphic being displayed, as that's more eye-catching, and then read the text if they'd like to know more details about that, because that kind of sinks into the background a bit more. I feel unity was achieved throughout my models with the use of the leader lines and the headers, as I think that was one thing that is the same throughout most of the sections in my display. I also think unity was achieved through some of the vertical lines and horizontal lines within each section. So in the location section, there are horizontal lines that you can see in the numbers display and in the time display as well, that kind of break up the section a little bit. You can also see in the numbers and time display that they do repetition of labels on the left top side, numbers for the number display going from 1 through 6, and then dates in the time display. Another thing that I think shows a lot of unity is the grouping of text in most of the displays, all left justified and usually within the same side, so your eye kind of gets used to this grouping of text. I think variety was showed in a couple of different places. The first being the large graphic up at the bottom. That itself showed a lot of variety from the rest of the graphics and text and everything else in the rest of the display. I also think that in the location display, there is a lot more detail than any of the other graphics, and this kind of mirrors the amount of detail that was found in the car interior section of my visual display model. So I tried to mimic that, but in a different location. I also think that the lines being overlapping and of different colors breaks up and shows a little bit more variation in my model as well. And within the time section, I tried to make it so that the graphics varied from being on the right side, and then there is the sushi and chopsticks, which is on the bottom, so that it looks a little bit more broken up, and this followed suit in my visual display model, as well as they had some graphics to the side and then some below. For the layout of my infographic, I tried to mimic my model as best as possible. I included things in the same location with the same amount of sections. So I included a larger section to the left side, and the spacing of each section across is the exact same as in my models. And then I made sure that my large graphic on the bottom was all the way starting at the left, with the cityscape stretching all the way to the right. I wanted to make sure that everything in my infographic aligned perfectly with my model infographic. So I did this by focusing on where my headers started and exactly where my leader lines were placed. So I made sure that the width of each section corresponded to the width within my model. The only thing that I varied slightly was possibly the lengths of each section, but I did try to make sure that they were roughly the same, or that the viewer could analyze them and recognize the similarities. And that I think I varied a little bit in my numbers display, as I had more information, so that one stretched a little bit longer. But I tried to make sure that everything aligned at the very top, and that I had enough spacing on the sides and within them that it would match my model, such as where the text isn't quite on the edge for each of the sections, there's a little bit more space, I made sure to match that to what my visual display model